God Within is an early access title built on the back of a solo developer, and as you'd expect with any one person working on an entire game, development is going slow. Slow or not though, the future outlook is positive for this passion project, with 4 notable updates being pushed in the month of May alone. Again, this game is early access, and from what I can tell it's pretty early on in the early access phase, but let's take a look at what God Within has going on so far, starting with one of the biggest factors in immersion. Few things catch the human eye as quickly as how something looks, and unfortunately these visuals are a bit rough around the edges. The layout of the environments you find yourself in aren't bad though. They don't feel as repetitive as you'd expect, and every time I found myself turning a corner expecting a basic dungeon room, I found something else entirely. One of which is this pretty interesting looking dungeon room. I can't tell if some of these places are supposed to open up eventually, but it looks like they're supposed to, and that's surprisingly pleasant for some reason. There's also the occasional textured surface that looks, stretched. You'll find varying levels of this throughout the map, which isn't entirely unexpected given the early access state of this game. This could all very well be placeholders, but something that might have a negative effect on your experience is the crazy amount of flickering. It's noticeable enough to possibly make you sick even after dialing in the settings to meet your preferences. It does get progressively worse too depending on where you're looking or standing. I wasn't getting any dropped frames during my playtime, so I think this is just due to poor optimization, but it's better to have problems like this in the early access since it could negatively affect the impression this game leaves as a full release. Speaking of impressions, let's talk about the theme. Now, it seems like the theme revolves around your quest to find the God within, I think. If I'm being honest, it was difficult to grasp the story. The first time I loaded into the game, I was bombarded with so many things at once, it felt eerily similar to those mobile games that hit you with a million pop-ups. To give the developers credit, a rework of the first launch experience is in the works, and it's nice that this is being both acknowledged and addressed. Speaking of acknowledgement, if you're enjoying this video so far, a like is always appreciated. But back on topic, there's definitely a plot here, though the delivery could use some work and suffers from that same information overload syndrome that most new fantasy titles experience. Small changes in pacing could fix this problem, but where the game seems to need the most work is in its mechanics. If you're familiar with Boneworks, the first major physics game for VR, you'll notice some similarities here with movement, though the execution is not quite as polished. Moving through the game can be challenging since every step on a flight of stairs can get you caught up unless you're constantly jumping. This and parts of your body clipping into and onto things adds to the clunkiness here. Then with movement, I often found myself wanting to move a little faster, but you don't sprint here. You do have the dash available, but it eats up your blue bar pretty quickly and it doesn't give you much travel, since it's intended for dodging, I guess. That aside, as basic as combat feels, there's definitely potential here. The enemies move more realistically and with more purpose than enemies in similar titles I've played, like popular VR fantasy fighting game Blade and Sorcery. The lacking aspect here would be predictability in combat, with enemies not only ignoring your defenses at times, but flat out requiring almost no skill to kill. For now at least, you can expect clunky movement and awkward combat, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this will improve with time, along with my subscriber count. I will say though, the options impressed me for a one-person army developing a VR game. Now, these options aren't perfect and many of them have their own gimmick, but the fact that the big ones are included is a huge plus. I've seen games developed by entire teams that botch this, ignoring or forgetting how important it is to feel comfortable in VR. Right from the start, the game allows you to calibrate your height, which is a useful feature for obvious reasons. Like other titles I've seen, it does so by simply having you hold your arms out and pull the trigger. It's worth noting though that this is not entirely accurate and it can be challenging to get your hands to feel right when using the recommended settings for your headset. You have 3 different presets with Meta and Pico controllers having their own custom settings, but the default works well enough from my testing. You also have the ability to adjust volume and graphical settings, which is something I've seen left out by entire dev teams, which baffles me, but I digress. Options like snap turning and the ability to play seated are included, though while these features are appreciated, this is the kind of game you definitely want to play standing due to the high risk of smacking your knees with your controllers. The audio isn't bad though, so let's talk about that real quick. Music is repetitive in this game, but that's not a bad thing in its case. It sets the tone for dungeon delving, and thanks to volume controls, can be dialed down for a more subtle background music experience. One of the audio highlights is the sound you hear when carving flesh. It's surprisingly gritty and gory, and it adds to that raw, visceral combat experience. As gross as that sounds, I think it's pretty cool. Yet again though, as expected, inconsistencies exist. There are a few times where things don't make noise when they should, like beating your weapon on your shield or the occasional silent blow to the head. The lack of feedback made me question if my attacks were connecting, and fortunately they were, so it's just an audio bug. And as for the voice acting, it's about what you'd expect from an indie game, but much better than expected from a one-person development team.
Before the gates of the chieftain lie 3 bull-headed statues glowing with crimson light.
It's nothing crazy professional in terms of audio or dialogue delivery, but it gets the job done. And this all brings me to how immersive this game is overall. I can't score this game like I would a full release because it's not a full release, but I will say that this game has the foundation for a solid VR gaming experience. You've got combat that could be very good if you worked out the bugs, you've got a theme that inspires exploration, and graphics that I honestly hope are just placeholders, but this game gives off early access vibes, which is a good thing because there's work to be done. But let me know what you guys think of this game in the comments below, and check out some of the other game content on my channel if you're a fan of VR gaming. But until next time, stay immersed.